I pulled into my driveway after a long day at court, eager to unwind in the comfort of my home. The idea of kicking back in my recliner with a glass of bourbon and a good book was the only thing keeping me sane through the endless property dispute cases I presided over. But as I reached for the garage remote, I noticed something strange. The lights inside were on. My car should have been the only one in the driveway, but there was a silver sedan parked where I usually stood. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe a neighbor had parked in the wrong spot, or a delivery driver had mistaken my home for another. But as I walked up to my front door, my key wouldn't fit. That was when reality slammed into me like a freight train. I knocked hard, pounding. A middle-aged man in a bathrobe, holding a steaming mug of coffee, answered the door like he'd been living there for years. He gave me a confused look, then a slow, patronizing smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, as if I was the one trespassing. I stared at him. "I think you're in the wrong house." The man chuckled and shook his head. "Nope. Bought it last week. Got a great deal, too. HOA auction." My vision went red. I felt my hands clench, a heat boiling in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. "This is my house." My voice was calm, controlled, but there was an edge to it. "I never put it up for sale." The man gave me a pitying look. "I'm sorry, but that's not what the HOA said. You had unpaid fees, so they foreclosed and sold it." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This had to be a mistake, a ridiculous, absurd mistake. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA office, pacing on the porch as the new owner sipped his coffee, completely unfazed. A woman answered on the second ring. "Maplewood HOA. How can I assist you?" "This is Judge Daniel Carter," I said sharply. "I just got home to find that my house, my legally owned, fully paid-for house, has been sold. I need an immediate explanation." There was a pause on the line, then a forced, rehearsed politeness. "Oh, Mr. Carter, yes. I see here that your home was foreclosed due to unpaid HOA fees." "I never missed a payment," I said through clenched teeth. "Not once." "Well, our records indicate otherwise. Perhaps you overlooked a fine." Something about her tone made my blood pressure spike. It wasn't just dismissive, it was smug. "Then pull up my account," I said. "Tell me exactly what I supposedly owe." There was a rustling of papers, keyboard clicks, a fake hum of thought. "Ah, yes. It seems you had an outstanding balance of $10. I nearly dropped my phone. $10. I repeated, voice dangerously low. "Yes, sir. It appears there was an administrative fee added last year that remained unpaid. Per HOA bylaws, any unpaid balance can result in foreclosure after 6 months." I let out a short, humorless laugh. This was beyond absurd. "You foreclosed on my house over $10. Rules are rules, sir." I ended the call before I said something that would have gotten me disbarred. My jaw was so tight it could have cracked a walnut. The man in the bathrobe, my home's supposed new owner, gave me an apologetic shrug. "Look, I don't know what to tell you. The sale's legal. Got the deed and everything. Maybe you can talk to the HOA, but as far as I know, this house is mine now." I took a step closer. He instinctively moved back. "I am Judge Daniel Carter," I said evenly. "I specialize in HOA litigation." His face paled. "You messed with the wrong guy." Before he could respond, flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. 2 police cruisers pulled up, and I turned to see 3 officers step out. My neighbor, old Mrs. Parker, watched from her window, her mouth forming a small O of shock. One of the officers approached me, a tall, stocky man with a badge that read Officer Reynolds. He gave me a wary look. "We got a report of a disturbance." I exhaled sharply, rubbing my temples. "There's no disturbance. I'm trying to get back into my own home." Reynolds exchanged a glance with the bathrobe guy, who suddenly looked a lot more confident with backup. "Sir, we have documentation stating this property was legally sold by the HOA," Reynolds said. "I understand this is frustrating, but you'll need to take this up with them." "You expect me to just leave?" "Yes, sir," he said firmly. "Otherwise, we'll have to escort you off the premises." I stared at him in disbelief. "You're telling me that my house was stolen, and you're siding with the people who stole it?" "Sir, if you refuse to leave, we'll have to consider it trespassing." I had never been so tempted to punch someone in my life, but I forced myself to stay calm. A judge getting arrested wouldn't do me any favors. I took a deep breath and turned back to the bathrobe man, who was now smirking like he had just won the lottery. "This isn't over," I said. "Not by a long shot." I walked away, feeling the stares of my neighbors burning into my back. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer rage boiling inside me. The HOA thought they had pulled a fast one. They thought they could get away with stealing my home, selling it like some abandoned property to fill their pockets. They had no idea who they had just messed with. By the time I reached my car, a plan was already forming in my mind. I was going to bring them down, not just for me, but for every single homeowner they had ever scammed. And I was going to make sure they never did it again. I sat in my car outside the HOA office, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The audacity, the sheer gall of these people to think they could pull something like this on me. $10. They stole my house over $10. I could still hear the smug tone in the HOA representative's voice, the way she dismissed me as if I were just another unfortunate victim of their so-called rules. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car, straightened my tie, and walked into the office. It was a modest building, pretending to be professional, but giving off the energy of a used car dealership. The receptionist looked up from her desk, an artificial smile plastered on her face. "Can I help you?" she asked in a syrupy voice. "I need to speak with Greg Simmons," I said. Her smile wavered just a little. "Mr. Simmons is in a meeting." "Then you'll interrupt him?" I said. "Tell him Judge Daniel Carter is here to discuss the illegal sale of my home." That did the trick. Her face paled slightly, and she fumbled with her desk phone before murmuring something into the receiver. Within minutes, a door at the far end of the room opened, and out walked Greg Simmons, the HOA president himself, a short, pudgy man with a receding hairline and a suit that looked 2 sizes too big. He had the unmistakable air of someone who thought he was untouchable. "Mr. Carter," he said, offering a tight smile. What a surprise. Not as surprised as I was to find out my house had been sold out from under me, I said. "We need to talk." He gestured toward his office, and I stepped inside. The room was cluttered with plaques of fake accolades, a few framed photos of Greg shaking hands with local politicians, and a desk covered in neatly stacked paperwork. He sat down with an exaggerated sigh, clasping his hands together. "I'm sure this is frustrating for you," he said. "But everything was done by the book." "Your book?" I said, narrowing my eyes. "Not the law." Greg smirked. "The HOA operates under its own set of regulations. Homeowners agree to abide by them when they purchase property in this community. If fees aren't paid, properties are subject to foreclosure." $10, I said, my voice sharp. "You're telling me my home was sold over a $10 fee?" He shrugged. "You should have paid it." I leaned forward. "You know damn well that fee was bogus. I never received a notice, never had a chance to dispute it. You and I both know this was a setup." Greg chuckled, shaking his head. "If you feel wronged, you're welcome to file a lawsuit. But I can tell you now, this HOA has a great legal team. We win these cases all the time." I stared at him, my anger simmering just beneath the surface. He thought this was a game. He thought I was just another homeowner who would roll over and accept my fate. "You've done this before, haven't you?" I said. "This isn't the first time you've stolen a home through shady loopholes." His smirk didn't waver. "The HOA has its ways of ensuring the community remains in good hands." I stood up, straightening my jacket. "Enjoy your power while it lasts, Greg, because I'm about to burn your whole corrupt empire to the ground." His smirk faltered just slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Good luck with that, Judge." I walked out of his office, my mind racing. If I was going to take these people down, I needed proof, not just of my own case, but of every scam they had pulled on innocent homeowners. My first stop was my neighbor, Mrs. Parker, an elderly widow. She had lived in the community for over 20 years. When I knocked on her door, she opened it cautiously, peering up at me through thick glasses. "Daniel," she said, a concerned look on her face. "I heard about what happened. It's just awful." "Mrs. Parker, has the HOA ever tried to fine you for something ridiculous?" I asked. She sighed, nodding. "Oh, all the time. They once charged me $500 for having the wrong shade of beige on my front door. I had to repaint it 3 times before they approved it." "And have they ever threatened foreclosure?" Her lips thinned. "Not me, but the Johnsons down the street. They lost their home last year over a so-called unpaid landscaping fee. They fought it in court, but lost. The HOA always wins." That confirmed what I already suspected. This was a pattern, a system of legal extortion disguised as community management. I spent the rest of the day talking to homeowners, and the stories were all the same. Families losing their homes over minor infractions, fines appearing out of nowhere, homes being auctioned off at suspiciously low prices. And every time, the new owners just happened to be connected to the HOA in some way. This wasn't just mismanagement, it was fraud. I needed a paper trail. The only way to prove this was to get my hands on the HOA's financial records. That meant digging where they didn't want me to dig. I called in a favor from an old friend, Mark Holloway, an investigative journalist who had built a career exposing corruption. When I explained the situation, he was immediately interested. HOA fraud, he said. Oh, that's a gold mine. People hate these organizations. If we can prove they're running an illegal foreclosure scheme, this could blow up. That's the plan, I said. But I need documents, proof of forged fees, shady sales, anything that links them to fraud. Mark hummed thoughtfully. I've got a contact at the county recorder's office. They keep records of all property transfers. If there's a pattern, we'll find it. That was exactly what I needed. If we could prove that the HOA was targeting specific homeowners, fabricating fines, and then selling the houses to their own people, it would be a legal disaster for them. Mark agreed to start digging while I focused on my next move. The HOA thought they could play their games without consequences. They had been getting away with it for years, but they had never gone up against someone who knew the system better than they did. As I drove back to my motel, the cheap, dingy room I was now forced to stay in, I felt the anger settle into something far more dangerous: determination. They had taken my home, but they had no idea what they had just started. By the time I was finished, there wouldn't be a single corrupt member of that HOA left standing. Sitting on the stiff motel bed, I flipped through the file Mark had managed to get from the county recorder's office. It was worse than I had imagined. The HOA had been running this scam for years, and they weren't even subtle about it. Page after page listed homes that had been foreclosed and sold under suspicious circumstances. The pattern was clear. Every property had been auctioned at a fraction of its value, and in most cases, the buyers were linked directly to HOA board members or their friends. It wasn't just corruption, it was an organized racket. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't going to be easy. Exposing fraud was one thing, but making it stick in court was another. I needed to prove intent. A mistake in record-keeping could be explained away, but a deliberate pattern of financial manipulation, that was criminal, and I was about to make sure they paid for it. Grabbing my laptop, I started drafting my case. Fraud, racketeering, abuse of power. There were multiple angles I could use. The key was proving that the HOA had knowingly manufactured fake fees to justify foreclosures. And I already had a lead. The homeowners I had spoken to had all received notices claiming they owed minor fees that they had never actually been informed about. If I could prove those fees were fabricated, I could take down the entire board. I needed more evidence, so I decided to go straight to the source. The next morning, I parked down the street from the HOA office, watching as employees trickled in. Greg Simmons, smug as ever, arrived last, stepping out of his black luxury sedan with the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. He strolled inside without a care in the world, completely unaware that his empire was about to come crashing down. I waited until the office was busy, then walked in like I belonged there. The receptionist barely looked up as I made my way toward the back. I had spent enough time in legal offices to recognize how they stored their documents. HOAs loved paper trails. Everything had to be documented to maintain their illusion of legitimacy. If there were forged records, they would be somewhere in the archives. Luck was on my side. A junior staff member had left a filing cabinet slightly ajar, and I could see stacks of foreclosure notices inside. Glancing around, I pulled out a few at random. Names I recognized jumped out at me, families who had lost their homes. Each file showed the same pattern: minor fees, vague notices, and then foreclosure. The documents looked official, but something was off. The signatures on the approval forms weren't consistent. It looked like someone had been forging authorization. Just as I was about to take a picture, a voice behind me made me freeze. Looking for something? I turned slowly to see a woman standing in the doorway, mid-40s, sharp eyes, and a look of suspicion. Her nameplate read Linda Pearson, HOA treasurer. Of course, the person responsible for handling money. I forced a smile, just reviewing some records. I wanted to check if my case was properly documented. She didn't smile back. That's confidential information. So is fraud, I said, sliding the file back into the cabinet. But that hasn't stopped this office before. Her eyes narrowed. You're the judge, aren't you? The one making a fuss. Fuss? I let out a short laugh. Is that what you call stealing people's homes? She took a step closer. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. I tilted my head, studying her. Unlike Greg, she wasn't arrogant. She was nervous. She knew something, and she was afraid of what I might uncover. I think I do, I said. But maybe you can help me understand. She glanced down the hallway, then back at me. You should leave. Not until I get what I need. There was a beat of silence. Then she exhaled sharply. "Meet me tonight. Parking lot behind the grocery store. 9 o'clock. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away. That was interesting. At exactly 9 p.m., I pulled into the darkened parking lot, my headlights off. Linda was already there, sitting in an old sedan, her fingers tapping against the steering wheel. When I approached, she rolled down the window just enough to speak. "I shouldn't be doing this," she muttered. "But you are," I said. "Which tells me you know this whole thing is rotten." She exhaled. "I didn't sign up for this. It was supposed to be a simple job, keep track of community funds, handle budgets." Then Greg started pushing these foreclosures. At first, I thought they were legitimate, but then I noticed discrepancies. "Fake fines," I said. She nodded. He'd bill homeowners for minor infractions, most of which they never knew about. The fees would accumulate on paper until they reached a point where the board could justify seizing the property. Then the homes would go to auction. But they weren't real auctions. "I know," I said. "Rigged sales to insiders." Her hands clenched into fists. "Greg has been pocketing the money." I tried to question it once, but he made it clear that I could either keep my mouth shut or find myself out of a job. "So why talk now?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because I know he's planning something bigger. He's gotten greedy. There's a plan to push out multiple homeowners in the next few months, people who are behind on minor payments, senior citizens who can't fight back. He's going to clear them out and sell the properties to developers for a fortune." My stomach turned. This wasn't just fraud, it was outright predatory. "Do you have proof?" I asked. She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. Financial records, emails, internal memos. Everything. I took it, staring at her. "This is enough to bury them." She nodded. "I hope so." Before I could say another word, she rolled up her window and drove off into the night. I sat there for a moment, gripping the USB drive tightly. This was the smoking gun. With this, I could take Greg and the entire HOA board down, not just in civil court, but criminally. The next morning, I met with Mark in his office, tossing the USB drive onto his desk. "What's this?" he asked. "The end of an empire," I said. He plugged it in, and as the files loaded on his screen, his eyes widened. "Holy, this is gold. Bank transfers, fraudulent fines, everything. This is going to blow up." "Make sure it does," I said. "We need this in the news before Greg has a chance to cover his tracks." Mark grinned. "Consider it done." That afternoon, while Mark worked on the expose, I filed the legal paperwork, a lawsuit against the HOA, a criminal complaint for fraud, and an injunction to freeze all property transactions under their management. Greg Simmons had played his little game for long enough. Now it was my turn. The courthouse was packed. Reporters, homeowners, and curious onlookers filled every available seat. The scandal had spread like wildfire. Mark's article had done its job, exposing the HOA's corruption to the entire community. Greg Simmons, once untouchable, now sat at the defendant's table, his normally smug expression replaced by one of barely concealed panic. His lawyer, a high-priced defense attorney, whispered furiously in his ear, but Greg barely seemed to hear him. He had built his empire on deception, and now it was crumbling in front of him. I sat at my table, calm and composed, flipping through my notes. The evidence was airtight. The USB drive from Linda had been a gold mine, filled with incriminating documents. Emails between Greg and his board members detailed their entire fraudulent scheme, how they had fabricated fees, targeted vulnerable homeowners, and sold the properties to their friends and associates for a profit. There were even messages where Greg outright joked about cleaning house and turning retirements into revenue. It was damning, and he knew it. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Judge Whitmore, a no-nonsense man with a reputation for being particularly unforgiving toward fraud cases, took his seat. I had argued before him many times. He had no patience for games, and Greg Simmons was about to learn that firsthand. The proceedings began, and the HOA's lawyer immediately tried to downplay the accusations. He claimed the foreclosures were legal, that every homeowner had agreed to the rules when they moved into the community. He insisted that the HOA had the right to collect fines and enforce its regulations. But I was ready for him. I stood and calmly laid out my argument. I detailed how the fines were fabricated, how homeowners were never properly notified, how the auctions had been rigged. I presented emails showing board members openly discussing which homes they could seize next, how they inflated fees just enough to justify a foreclosure. I showed bank records where money from these sales had been funneled into personal accounts. Then I called my first witness. Linda Pearson took the stand, her hand shaking slightly as she took the oath. She looked nervous but determined. I guided her through her testimony, carefully making sure she felt in control. She explained how she had initially believed the fines were legitimate but grew suspicious when she saw patterns in the records. She admitted that Greg had personally instructed her to backdate fees and alter financial statements. And when I asked her why she had come forward, she looked directly at Greg and said, "Because I couldn't keep watching innocent people lose their homes." Greg's lawyer objected, claiming her testimony was biased, but I wasn't done yet. I called homeowner after homeowner to the stand. Mrs. Parker told the court how she had been forced to repaint her door multiple times just to avoid fines. The Johnsons explained how they had tried to dispute their so-called unpaid landscaping fee, only to be ignored and then evicted. Each story painted a picture of systematic abuse, of an HOA that didn't serve its community but preyed on it. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I called Greg Simmons to the stand. His lawyer tried to protest, but the judge allowed it. Greg walked up stiffly, his usual arrogance replaced by visible unease. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and tried to look composed, but I could see the sweat forming on his brow. I started simple, asking him about his role as HOA president, his responsibilities, his understanding of the foreclosure process. He answered carefully, trying to frame himself as a man simply following the rules. But then I pulled out the emails. I read them aloud, each one a nail in his coffin. Emails where he explicitly told his board members to get creative with fines, messages where he mocked elderly homeowners, calling them easy targets, an exchange where he bragged about how much money he had made from the latest auction. His face turned red. His lawyer tried to object, claiming the emails were taken out of context, but it was too late. The damage was done. Then I went in for the kill. "Mr. Simmons," I said, holding up the financial documents, "can you explain why the proceeds from these home sales were transferred directly into an offshore account registered under your name?" The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the clicking of reporters' cameras. Greg's mouth opened and closed, his hands gripping the witness stand so tightly his knuckles turned white. His lawyer jumped up, demanding a recess, but the judge silenced him with a glare. "Answer the question, Mr. Simmons," Judge Whitmore said. Greg stammered, reaching for an excuse, but there was none. He had been caught. The prosecution wrapped up, and the judge took a recess before delivering his decision. I sat back in my chair, watching Greg whisper frantically to his lawyer. He knew it was over. The evidence was overwhelming. Even if he somehow avoided jail, he would never be able to show his face in this community again. When the judge returned, the room fell into an anxious hush. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at Greg, then at me. "The court finds that the Maplewood HOA, under the leadership of Mr. Greg Simmons, engaged in fraudulent and unethical practices resulting in the illegal foreclosure of multiple homes," he said, his voice firm. "As such, all property sales conducted under these fraudulent conditions are hereby nullified. Furthermore, the court will be referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scribbled furiously, homeowners hugged each other, and Greg Simmons looked like he was going to be sick. His lawyer was already packing up, no doubt preparing an appeal, but it wouldn't matter. The ruling was clear. Every stolen home would be returned. Justice had been served. As the court adjourned, homeowners approached me, shaking my hand, thanking me. Mrs. Parker had tears in her eyes as she told me how much it meant to her. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about my home. It was about every person who had been wronged. Greg Simmons, now pale and shaken, was escorted out of the courtroom by his lawyer. As he passed me, he stopped for just a moment, looking at me with something between hatred and fear. "This isn't over," he muttered. I smiled. "Oh, it absolutely is." He walked out, and I turned back to the homeowners, my neighbors, the people who had stood together against corruption, and the HOA had tried to take everything from us, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. And I had made sure of it. Greg Simmons walked out of that courtroom with his tail between his legs, but I knew he wasn't going down without a fight. People like him never did. The kind of man who spent his entire life scamming others, thinking he was untouchable, didn't just accept defeat and fade away. He would try to worm his way out of the consequences, maybe appeal the decision, or worse, try to pull some last-minute stunt to save himself. But it didn't matter. I was already 3 steps ahead. The first thing I did after the ruling was make sure every homeowner affected by the HOA scam got their homes back. That meant working with real estate lawyers, filing the necessary paperwork, and ensuring that the nullified sales went through the proper legal channels to reverse the damage. It wasn't an overnight process, but people were getting their houses back. The Johnsons, who had been forced out over a landscaping fee, moved back in that same week. Mrs. Parker, who had been worried she'd have to spend her last years in some rundown apartment, was already planning a backyard garden again. Seeing the relief on their faces made everything worth it. Greg, on the other hand, was not doing so well. His accounts had been frozen, his assets seized, and the district attorney was already looking into criminal charges. The moment those offshore accounts had come to light, it was only a matter of time before he was in handcuffs. The irony was, for a man who had spent years profiting off other people's misfortunes, he suddenly found himself broke. Without his stolen wealth, he had nothing. His lawyer must have realized the sinking ship he was on because, within a week, Greg was representing himself and doing a terrible job at it. But what really made me smile was what happened to his house. The very same mansion he had bought with stolen money, the one he had used as a symbol of his power over the community, was now up for auction. It was poetic justice, and I had every intention of making sure it ended up in the right hands. The auction was a quiet affair, mostly because Greg had tried to fight it. He had argued in court that the sale of his house was illegal, that he had earned his wealth fair and square, and that the community owed him. The judge didn't even let him finish his speech before dismissing him. The auction moved forward, and there I was, sitting in the front row, waiting for my moment. Greg's eyes locked onto mine the moment I raised my hand for the opening bid. The look on his face was priceless. He knew exactly what I was doing, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. I kept my bid steady, letting a couple of other interested parties play their hands before I made my final move. And then, just like that, Greg Simmons's house, the house he had built his reputation on, was mine. After the auction, he stormed up to me, his face red with fury. "You think this is funny?" he spat. I slipped the property deed into my jacket pocket, giving him a calm smile. "Oh, I think it's hilarious." He clenched his fists, his whole body trembling with rage. "You ruined me." "No, Greg," I said, stepping closer. "You ruined yourself." He opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, the man who had controlled an entire community, who had dictated people's lives, was completely powerless. And he knew it. I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of victory settle over me. But I wasn't done yet. The HOA was officially dissolved. The homeowners association that had terrorized the neighborhood for years was no more. After everything that had come to light, no one wanted to keep it alive. Instead, we held a community meeting to decide how things would be run moving forward. People who had once been at each other's throats over minor infractions were now working together, setting up a fair system where homeowners actually had a say in how their neighborhood was managed. Some people suggested forming a new HOA with honest leadership, but the idea was quickly shut down. No one wanted to risk another Greg Simmons situation. Instead, the community opted for a simple, democratic approach: volunteer committees to handle maintenance, a collective fund for shared services, and most importantly, complete transparency. No one would ever lose their home over a bogus fee again. With the neighborhood finally free, I decided it was time to move back into my home. The moment I stepped through that front door, it felt different. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol, a reminder that no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, they can always be held accountable. As I settled back in, enjoying the feeling of reclaiming what was mine, I got a knock at the door. When I opened it, I was met with the last person I expected to see. Greg Simmons stood there, looking like a man who had lost everything. His once expensive suit was wrinkled, his face was unshaven, and the arrogance that had once oozed from him was completely gone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, shifting uncomfortably. "What do you want, Greg?" I asked, folding my arms. He cleared his throat. I need a place to stay." I blinked, certain I had misheard him. "Excuse me." He looked down, as if ashamed. "I lost everything. They took my accounts, my cars, my savings. I don't have anywhere to go." I let the silence stretch between us, watching him squirm. Then I stepped forward and gave him a long, hard look. "You remember when I came home that night?" I asked. "When I found out you had sold my house out from under me?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah. You remember what you told me?" I continued. "You told me the sale was legal, that I should have paid my fees, that it wasn't your problem." His jaw tightened. "Daniel, come on." I took another step closer, lowering my voice. "It's not my problem either." I shut the door in his face. For a few seconds, I just stood there, listening. No knocking, no pleading, just silence. Then, finally, the sound of footsteps retreating down the front steps. I walked back into my living room, poured myself a glass of bourbon, and sank into my recliner. Outside, the neighborhood was peaceful. No HO board, no ridiculous fines, no power-hungry president lurking over everyone's shoulders. For the first time in a long time, things felt right. Justice had been served. The morning air felt different, crisp, clean, peaceful. No longer did I wake up dreading some ridiculous HOA notice pinned to my door or fear the sound of a knock signaling another bogus fine. The community was finally free from the tyranny of Greg Simmons and his corrupt board, and for the first time in years, everyone could breathe easily. As I stepped outside onto my front porch, coffee in hand, I looked down the street and saw my neighbors finally living their lives without fear. The Johnsons were putting up decorations for their daughter's birthday, without anyone telling them they were violating some arbitrary aesthetic rule. Mrs. Parker sat on her porch, humming softly as she read the morning paper, her flowers in full-bloom flowers that Greg once fined her for planting because they weren't HOA approved. Kids rode their bikes freely, their laughter filling the air. It was exactly how a neighborhood was supposed to feel. A knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. For a moment, instinct kicked in, and I expected the worst. Years of HOA harassment had trained me to assume that any unexpected visit meant trouble. But when I opened the door, I was met with a sight that made me smile. It was a group of homeowners, people who had fought alongside me in taking back our neighborhood. Mark, my journalist friend, stood among them, along with Linda Pearson, the former HOA treasurer who had helped bring Greg down. The Johnsons, Mrs. Parker, and even a few others who had been wronged by the scam stood there, smiling. "We wanted to thank you," Mark said, holding up a small envelope. I raised an eyebrow, taking the envelope and opening it. Inside was a gift certificate to my favorite steakhouse, along with a handwritten note signed by nearly every homeowner in the community. It was simple, but it meant everything. "You didn't just win a case," Mrs. Parker said. "You gave us our homes back." I nodded, touched by the gesture. "You all fought just as hard. This was never just about me." Linda stepped forward. "Some of us were talking, and we'd like you to lead the new community council. No more HOA, just a group of homeowners making decisions together. And we trust you." I took a deep breath, looking at the hopeful faces around me. It was an honor, but I had spent years fighting against power-hungry individuals who let control corrupt them. The last thing I wanted was to become the very thing I had taken down. "I appreciate it," I said. "But I think the best way to make sure this neighborhood never falls into the wrong hands again is for everyone to have an equal say. No presidents, no rulers, just neighbors working together." There were nods of agreement. It was the right call. Everyone had seen what happened when a small group held unchecked power. They wouldn't make that mistake again. As the group dispersed, I turned back toward my house, only to see a familiar figure standing across the street, Greg Simmons. He looked worse than the last time I had seen him. His once expensive suit was now wrinkled beyond recognition, his shoes scuffed, his face hollow with exhaustion. He had no home, no money, and no allies left. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the smirk he wore the night he stood in my doorway, telling me that my home wasn't mine anymore. I remembered the arrogance, the greed, the way he had toyed with people's lives like they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. He stared at me, and I could see the desperate hope in his eyes, as if he expected me to help him. Maybe he thought I'd offer him a place to stay, a way to rebuild. I didn't. Instead, I turned around and walked back inside my house, shutting the door behind me. Greg had made his choices. He had destroyed lives for profit, bullied families into submission, and laughed in the faces of those he hurt. And now, standing alone on a street that no longer feared him, he was facing the consequences of his own actions. Later that evening, I fired up the grill in my backyard, letting the aroma of steaks fill the air. A few neighbors came over, bringing drinks and chairs, and soon the backyard was filled with laughter and conversation. It felt good, normal, like things were finally as they should be. Mark leaned over with a smirk. "You know, this whole thing would make a hell of a book." I laughed. "You write it, and I'll take a free signed copy." Linda raised her glass. "To never having an HOA again." "To never having an HOA again," we all echoed, clinking our glasses together. As the night stretched on, I looked around at the people who had once been strangers, but now felt like family. This wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community, a real one. Justice had been served. The tyrant had fallen. And for the first time in a long time, I was home. And this time, no one was ever going to take it from me again.